It's terrific to see so many familiar faces here tonight. If we haven't met before, my name is Steve Whitla. I run a consultancy here in Oxford where I'm speaking from right now called Visual Meaning. It's sometimes hard to describe what we do in words, so it's often easier, we find, particularly with clients, to just show what we do. Basically, we take things like the model on the left and turn them into models that look a bit more like the one on the right. And the idea is that when you're trying to do organizational change, what often gets in the way is that every different silo, every different tribe in the organization tends to see the organization in a different way. So we seek to create models, create maps, create representations that people can, that all of the different factions within the organization can see themselves in order to enable more meaningful conversations about what you're trying to change. Now, I've been doing this sort of work for at least 15 years, and over that time, we've tried all sorts of different techniques of diagramming and picture making. And a couple of years ago, somebody got in touch with me and said, "Do you fancy writing a book about all this?" So me and my co-author, Jonathan, decided that we should do just that. So Jonathan is an enterprise architect. I come from more of a change background, and we started having this dialogue about what the appropriate uses are for all these different types of diagramming and modeling techniques that we'd come up with. So we came up with this framework in the book, which is, it's very simple. If you take a y-axis of how abstract or concrete the form of representation you have is, in other words, how much does the diagramming or the picture making technique, how much does it resemble the thing that you're actually modeling? So is it more pictorial? Is it more abstract? Is it lines and boxes? Is it words? Is it icons and so on? And then you've got this x-axis, which is how constrained is the visual language? So is it okay to just grab a piece of paper and scribble whatever you want on one hand, or are you constrained by some sort of standard and ISO specification? And what we found was that when you map out all the different diagramming techniques, they're not evenly spread across this map. They tend to conform to a diagonal line, where on the top left, you've got the sorts of representations that tend to be made by more communications-based constituencies, business change managers, designers, and so on. And then at the bottom right, you've got this other constituency of engineers, architects, more technical type of people, and they often don't talk to each other that much. If you've been on organization transformation programs, you'll be familiar with this. And what's interesting in this context is when we came to all of the various systems modeling techniques, there's a whole variety of them, and you could probably do another exercise of figuring out where in this model they fit. But we thought, on the whole, they tend to be sort of somewhere around the middle, because you tend to find often systems people are trying to join these different constituencies together. And that led us to start thinking about what are all the different ways that you can achieve what we came to call shared meaning. So different constituencies, how can we draw them together towards a common end? Right, here's what's hopefully a vaguely familiar diagram for many of you. Probably one of the most famous of all system models. This is from the sort of the centerfold picture from the original Limits to Growth paperback from 1970, something like that, 50 odd years ago. And I want to ask you what this reminds you of. What does it look like? Because I remember the first time I saw this thinking, do you know what it looks a bit like meatballs, right? Looks a bit like spaghetti. And of course, these kinds of diagrams often get called that, right? These are spaghetti diagrams. And it was interesting before the call talking to Ed, who was one of the judges on the Map the System competition, which is run out of Oxford here every year, which is a competition we've had quite a long association with. I was on the judging panel last year for it. And it's so inspiring seeing these teams of students grappling with complex systemic problems in social sustainability sort of spaces, environmental spaces. And they do these amazing systemic analyses, but the nature of the competition is basically judged on two counts. One is what's the quality of the analysis? How good a systemic research project have you done? But then the second half is, can you represent your findings in a way that would be meaningful to a general audience? And the thing that struck me is that there's tons and tons of methodology for how you would do the first part of that, right? Where's the methodology for how you do the second part? And these guys really struggle, that they spend weeks and weeks of their own time exhaustively trying to understand all the patterns that could explain why a particular situation is as it is. And then you get, all these moments of insight and eureka moments. You think, I think that could be the pattern. This could be the. But then what do you do with the results? How do you share those insights with not just a general audience, but particularly the people who are struggling with the patterns that you're trying to model? And that's really what I want to talk about tonight, is what would that sort of methodology look like? What would it look like if we started building a methodology around shared meaning into our toolkit as systems practitioners? So let's dissect these terms a little bit. We talked about meaning and I've talked about shared, and I want to go through each one of those in a little bit more detail. So first of all, this idea of meaning. What is meaning? It's often a word that gets used in quite a loose sort of sense, and sometimes it gets used in the very technical sense. If you've ever tried to explore the whole field of semiotics, which is, theoretically, that's the academic study of meaning, and some of the texts, they're just very, very heavy and dense. And I want to propose a much more intuitive way of thinking about meaning, which is that meaning is a feeling. It's something that you sense emotionally. It's something that you feel. It's a sense. And like all emotions, all feelings, there's a givenness to it. It's not something you rationalize. It's not something you read a book on and think, I'm having an experience of meaning because I figured out something like an equation. It's something that happens, which means that it's not just, I make sense of something and then I say, oh, that was a meaningful experience. I know that thing makes sense because I had this feeling of meaning. And actually, just tying this back into organizational transformation, there's lots of controversy about how many transformation programs actually succeed in their outcomes. If you've worked on them, it's very hard to know exactly how you'd measure that. I don't think I've ever worked on a large-scale transformation program that has delivered exactly what it set out to. Doesn't mean it doesn't deliver anything, but the ones I can think of that certainly have fulfilled their promise are very, very few in number. And I think one of the reasons is that the engagement that happens with staff feels much more like the picture on the right here than it feels like the picture on the left. And you sense meaning in your body. It's an embodied feeling when you're in meetings, when you're at conferences, when you're attending sessions, when you're over Zoom calls like this, you feel it in your body. So what are the precursors of that feeling? And I suggest, and I think this is borne out when you do the word study on how this concept comes about in different languages of meaning. All language families have a word that is equivalent to this English word meaning. There's two sides to it. One is, if you're into semiotics, which is all about signs, you would call it signification. So what does this thing mean in terms of what does it signify? And the feeling you get when it signifies something to you is the feeling of, I get it. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's not enough to generate the feeling of meaning because you might not care about it. You need to have that side as well. So when you read something, you think this matters. That's the experience of significance. And meaning is the feeling you get when you have experienced both of these things at the same time. It's not enough just to understand something because I know what you mean, but it's not very meaningful to me. And then on the other hand, wow, I get the sense this is important, but I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. You need to have both at the same time, and you get this feeling of meaning. Why is this important? This is important because the energy that you get, that you sense when you're in those meetings, when you're on those conference calls, when you're on those Zoom calls, the energy that you sense drives change. And this happens at a personal level. So forget the sharedness of the meaning. Just think about this feeling of meaning when you've had it yourself. When you sense something is significant, when you sense that this is something I really care about, you end up wanting to understand more of it. And the more you understand of something, also you tend to find out, I care about this because I'm finding more and more about it. This is how people end up in these really obscure, professions and academic enterprises. It's because you started reading something and you got more and more into it. And the more you get into it, the more the connections start to happen and meaning just feels good. So it drives personal change. And this is the whole energy you see in schools with learning as kids think, wow, that's interesting. That's interesting. Then you start to find you care more about it. But when that happens at a group level, you start to get organizational shifts. When it's not just I get it, it's like, wow, we all get it. And actually, this is really important, isn't it? And I think it's that energy that drives change at a systems level. So that's about meaning. What about this term shared? And I want to suggest 3 ways that we can approach what it means for meaning to be shared. So 3 ways into it. So if meaning is a feeling, what does it mean for that meaning to be shared? What are 3 ways? Well, how could we approach the sharedness of the meaning? And I want to suggest 3 ways that we could use this word shared. The first one is about the sharedness of the perspective that we come from. And this is the one I think probably most familiar to us as systems practitioners. This is the sense that when you're working with a group of people who are stuck in some sort of adverse pattern and they're suffering as a result of something, when you look at it from their perspective alone, one perspective isn't enough. I'll give you an example of this. This has come up multiple times for us. There are very, very similar patterns to this across many clients. And you'll identify with this, right? Something goes wrong to do with something you need to call an engineer out for, a problem with your water or your electricity or your broadband or whatever it is. And somebody gets called out and you have to take a day off work, and that kind of sucks a bit. But when the person turns out, it turns out they can't solve the problem, right? Because they don't have the right tools, or they thought they went to the wrong address, or they turn up too late, and that's really, really frustrating. But it's also frustrating for the engineer because they want to provide good service and they can't. So who do they blame? Well, they'll generally blame the person back in dispatch, the person in operations, the field team, who didn't put in the right information, sent me to the wrong address, gave me the wrong job code. And if you go back and find the person in operations and say, well, what's the problem here? Why does the information keep getting put in? Well, they'll have somebody to point to as well, right? Which will generally be customer services. Well, if customer service, if they just got the right information from the customer, we'd be able to code it properly. So you go and talk to customer services, and customer services said, well, yeah, that's all very well, but we have got such massive resourcing issues because half our people are off in stress because customers keep abusing them because of the field agents. Our engineers, if they could just solve the problem first time, we wouldn't have this problem. But all we ever get is customers calling up complaining because of the quality of our service. Now, here's the point. From any one of those perspectives, the finger of blame makes perfect sense. But when you zoom out to see the whole pattern, the whole thing shifts. Now come back to the sharedness of the perspective. What happens if you can draw all of those people out and show them the pattern from a zoomed out perspective? And this is an essential attribute of systemic intervention, is training yourself to be able to see the pattern of the whole, to see what emergent properties are being manifest in the system before you go in and start deciding who's right at the level of a single operating unit. And you all know this, but I think it's an important way of thinking about the sharedness of meaning is what's the perspective that we're taking? The more we try to seek a shared perspective rather than picking one operating unit, but just think about this organizationally, one operating unit, one ideology, one political persuasion, one worldview, the more it has to be from this perspective, the less you see the whole. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about it. Here's another one, the sharedness of the symbols that we use. So we see a pattern. We start checking whether that pattern makes sense. We start dancing with the system. How do we represent it? And because this is very much a VSM practice group, I have to reference Stafford. As with most things, Stafford is ahead of the curve by about, when this is from Heart of Enterprise. So he's writing this in the 1970s, long before design thinking and service design and all the rest of it. Let's look at this phrase at the bottom. So the phrase house style, this is towards the end of Heart of Enterprise, covers the variety attenuating activities of System 2's One Design. Apologies, by the way, if you're not a VSM person, then I don't have time to explain it. Come along to one of the development courses and it'll all make more sense. But only when it is fully understood. House style as graphic art is very much part of the story. It is a massive variety attenuator. And that's kind of cybernetic code for it reduces complexity. And it is fascinating, so this fascinating that artists rather than managers have deeply understood this role. Managers see frills here where they should see more basic garments. Managers see frills here where they should see more basic garments. So in a sense, this whole talk that I'm sharing with you now is kind of an exploration of what would graphic design look like if it was a more basic garment. Because I mean, this is the problem that we've always been trying to overcome as a consultancy, as people see pictures and think, oh, nice, pretty pictures. And if you remember that diagonal I showed you from our book, where you've got one group, architects, technical people who, we're into accuracy, it needs to be accurately represented. And then you show them something visual and pictorial, and you'll find if you use SSM and you use rich pictures, you often find the same thing happens. Well, it's just pictures, it's pretty pictures. We can't use pretty pictures. So what would happen if we saw it as more basic garments and not just frills, not just pretty graphics? I'll just show you this very quickly. I'm not going to go through all this. This is one of the reference things, reference materials that we use when we're doing visual language training. And the meaning that we can create, the level of shared meaning that we can create, what we tend to find with people who've been trained in visual language and do graphic facilitation and use a lot of visuals in their work, is that they start at the top left with all the elements of whatever the content is, the interview notes or the models, the workshop diagrams and all the rest of it, and then immediately start putting symbols on top of it. So we could draw this like this, and we could draw this like this, and we could draw this like this. But what happens if you start doing the systemic analysis first? Well, hang on, what are the relationships between these things? What are the patterns that we're seeing? What are the structures that make sense of how this, whatever it is manifesting? And then switch across into the domain of the visual language. So how would you compose that in a way that would make sense to the maximum number of people? Now, here's the point. On the right-hand side of this image, here's a whole bunch of stuff that's to do with visual language. This is all of the things that Beer's talking about around variety attenuation. How do you reduce complexity? Well, if you've got consistency of visual syntax, if the meaning of all of your visual images corresponds neatly, not just to the elements, the individual elements, where you go, it's a nice icon for this, and nice, but actually you can represent the relationships between, well, what if we could show the deeper structures and we had the corresponding level of sophistication in our visual language that we could represent it? What would happen? What sort of conversations would that enable? Third one, sharedness of cognition. And this is, I just want to point this out because so often we, and this is true, certainly true in systems practice circles, we're very keen to make sure that we respect the diversity of perspectives and groups, which is fantastic, fantastic. At the same time, we have to acknowledge the fact that the vast majority of our cognition, which is mostly unconscious to us all, works in a very, very similar way between people. And if we understand what we have in common in the way that our brains work, in the way that we perceive content, the way our visual apparatus works, we can exploit those commonalities to create shared meaning. And I remember when I started reading originally primarily books on cognitive linguistics as a field, and started getting more and more into cognitive science. And yeah, it's another one of these things, you wish you had known the future when you chose your degree, because I just love to really study, in much more depth. But, even from what I've read, there's so much richness in this field that hasn't yet been transferred into methodology that could be, which I find really, really exciting. I mean, let me just give you some examples. Here's another example of a little thing that we do on the course as a little bit of fun. So which of these is not a bird? I'm going to show you 9 animals, one of which is not a bird. Which one is it? And statistically, by now, you'll all have figured out which one it is. So the one sort of the bottom row, one from the left, is actually a hummingbird hawk moth. But it's probably took you a minute to figure that out, because there's another one just next to it which doesn't have any wings, which is kind of weird for a bird. And the one on the other side, the ostrich, the wings are tiny. It's got some massive neck. It's not very bird-like at all. So it probably took a minute to figure that stuff out. Now, there's science behind this about why that occurs. Yeah, I'm sure a number of you will be familiar with Eleanor Roche, probably better known for her involvement in, right at the start of the enactivist field of cognitive theory. So she wrote a very famous book with Evan Thompson and Varela called The Embodied Mind. But actually before that, where she made her name was in research on categorization. And this, again, is very, very old, 1975, where she started doing these studies to see how quickly do people recognize and make a category decision about something. And the big insight was that categories aren't fixed blocks, right? Depending on how typical an example is of a category, and will determine how quickly you recognize something. So at the top there's birds. On average, it takes about 6 seconds for people to recognize that a bat is a bird, even though it's not a bird. So that's a bit confusing. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got sparrows. Sparrow is the most typical bird for the general population. Furniture. Is a telephone a piece of furniture? Not sure. Chair. Yeah, bingo. Straight away. Now let me show you what this looks like visually. Let's do the same exercise again. So here's another 9, 10 animals. Which of these is not a bird? And hopefully that didn't take quite so long, because, well, look what I've done. I've added another 10 birds, all of which are very sparrow-like, and they're all facing the same direction. Now, the point is, you can study this, right? There's research studies that show what the statistical curve is of shared meaning, right? What does a bird look like? All the people say a sparrow is a bird. You get a few people will make a mistake that maybe a bat is a bird, or maybe a hawking bird. It'll take a lot longer. So the shape of your distribution is kind of broad, because the things on the outside aren't very good examples of a bird. Whereas the second example is really narrow, because the zebra is facing the other direction and it doesn't look like a bird at all. I mean, this is just a tip of a very, very, very large iceberg. And my point is just, who is taking all that research together and applying it? I'll answer this in a second, because it's not who you might think. Who's taking that research and applying it to deliberately create shared meaning? What if you could squash together the perception people have of the symbols you create, so they immediately get it, like, wow, that pattern, that's important. I get it. I can see why it's important. I want to do something about it. And just because this is SCiO, I have to show this one, because there's always going to be an outlier who's, no matter what you say, it's going to be somebody who disagrees with you. And I might use this at the end, when we have Q&A. And anyway, so how would you use that to practical effect for building system models? Here's another example of cognitive insight into visual perception. And you'll all have seen this. Is this 2 faces? Is it a goblet? And of course, it depends. Do you focus on the white? Do you focus on the black? But what's really interesting about these kinds of ambiguous figures is you can't see both of those things at the same time. When you start you're trying to make it conscious. That I'm going to flick it back and forward, the black face, white goblet, and it flicks back and forward, and you can, but trying to narrow it down to the point and sort of squinting your eyes to get just the point where you can never get the point where it flicks back and forth. And illusions like this, and this is true across all cognition, but visually, when you create an illusion like this, it shows you what the commonalities are in our cognitive processes, because that's true for everybody. And what it tells us is that the way our cognition works is it wants to foreground things against backgrounds. That's how it works, because it's embodied. And what do bodies do? We manipulate the things that are in our environment. Our cognition has to work that way because the world is the way it is. Now, what if we started using that sort of insight in the way that we represent systems? So I just want to give you an example of what that could look like in practice. Let me just flick this over. Hopefully that's, can I just check, can somebody just give me a thumbs up that you're seeing a web screen there?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. So this is a model that we made for a conference that was run last week on responsible capitalism. And we had all these different groups of NGOs and corporates and people coming together with a shared interest in how the economic system could be changed in a positive direction. And we had this idea that, well, what if we could create a sort of like a base map of all of the different elements of the economic system? And then we could start tracing over that where all these different actors are playing. And then we said, well, could we start showing some of the systemic patterns that cause this whole system to be stuck in equilibrium? Now, what's that got to do with the figure grounding version I was just showing you? Well, it's taking advantage of the fact that that's the way human cognition works. We want to see things against a background. Now, if you have a shared background that everyone agrees, yeah, that represents the world as I experience it, then we can have a meaningful conversation about the things that we overlay on across the top of it, even if we disagree. So what would it be like if we had these kinds of shared representations where you could show me your perspective or the pattern that you think is really important by overlaying it on top of the map, and I could show you a completely different perspective and somebody else could show me a different perspective? What if we could start putting data, embedding data into the model to start saying, well, is there, can we validate some of these assumptions? So to show you what this could look like, just play around with this for a second. And this is all free to access and use and do what you would like with. If we take all of these actors, this literally works like a map. I'm sure many of you have seen our work before where we like things to actually feel like maps. So here's all the various actors. We've put all of the main ones on, and we hope that we've put it in a way that makes sense in a neutral sort of way, because what is the economic cycle? Well, we have all these various resources from our shared home, our planet. We have all these various industries that seek to create value from all of those resources through a whole value stream. And then we end up trying to satisfy all the various needs that we have as humanity. And then we generate a colossal amount of waste, and then a small percentage of the outputs of that process go back into it as recyclables and biodegradables. So if that's your base map, what could you start putting on top of it? Well, let's zoom back out. Well, why is it the way that it is? Well, one of the ways you could say it is the way it is because of shareholders being right in the center. Under the Friedman doctrine, what do corporations exist to do? They exist to maximize shareholder value. But of course, shareholders, the vast majority of shareholders are actually investment intermediaries who act on behalf of investors. And the performance management of these corporations is driven by that relationship. And the investment intermediaries assume that the way that they meet their clients' best interests is by maximizing the financial return. But who are those investors? Well, there's a whole bunch of different actors, but ultimately they're people. So who gets to decide what serves humanity's best interests? And then notice what's left out of that entire equation. What about I really like this one. Where do our basic assumptions that this is the way an economy should work, where do they come from? Well, let's go, this was done through the auspices of the SCiO Business School, which is interesting in itself. Well, how do business schools work? Well, a lot of how they work is to try to maximize global rankings. The higher you are up the global rankings, the more fees you can charge. But of course, the more fees you can charge, the more your graduates end up in debt. And the more you end up in debt, the less choice you have about where you go into this system. So, you could go into government, but you realistically, you're going to be in debt the rest of your life. You certainly probably can't go to an NGO unless you've got rich parents. So you're left either going to a corporate and trying to rise as rapidly as you can, but of course the only way that you can rise is by following the Friedman doctrine and maximizing shareholder value and reinforcing the whole system, or you could fast track the whole thing and go into finance. So here's the point. All of those stories are just stories that I'm telling. And you could find some of them deeply upsetting, or you could be cheering and saying, yes, that's it. But they all speak to systemic patterns that we are positing exist. And the only way that we can create shared meaning about it is because they are rendered on top of a map that is intuitive and meaningful to people, we hope. And this is only, this is a prototype. This is us experimenting with what happens when we draw all three of those aspects together. Right, back to slides. So last slide. These are the three things that I talked about. The sharedness of perspective, so taking a systemic perspective. The sharedness of the symbols that we create, so how big is, how sophisticated and large is your visual vocabulary as you're creating renderings of the systemic insights and perspectives that you are taking. And thirdly, understanding how cognition works, so the sharedness about our cognitive apparatus that allows us to achieve shared meaning in the first place. So here's the question, how good are we at all these? Because I hope all of this on this call, if we consider ourselves to some degree to be systemic practitioners, hopefully we all think that we're good at taking a systemic perspective. How's our visual language skills? How good are we at understanding how human cognition works? So if I take these three things together, on one hand, we've got the content that we're looking for. On one hand, we've got the representation, and if you're into semiotics, you could probably see this as a, as a semiotic triangle, but I'll not get into that because I'm running out of time. Representation, content, and audience together. Now, I said earlier, who is doing this? Who's drawing all these things together to create shared meaning? And I think if you make one small change to this diagram, you can see a group of people who are doing it to highly effective results. And that's advertisers, those in marketing communications, those in PR. If you take out the top right, what's the content? And forget about systemic. In fact, invert it. Let's do the opposite of a systemic perspective. Let's drill right down into a particular interest group, a particular market segment, a particular section of the population, and let's try and shift their behavior. That's kind of what branding is, right? What's branding except the collated, the collected shared meanings and associations that people have with a particular corporate identity. But it could also be political. We think that this particular demographic here, if we could shift them from there to there, where we're going to have to, but you're trying to create a shared meaning and identity around a group in order to affect some sort of change of behavior. And it works because they've got all of these things. You have very highly paid advertising strategists in the top right-hand corner who are doing that thing, do the opposite of zoom out, zoom in, figure out, what messaging is going to work for this group of people. We've got a whole creative department who have amazingly sophisticated ways of using symbols. And then we pull in behavioral psychologists. We pull in people who understand how the brains of that particular group of people work better than they do themselves. And then we generate output and we shift their behavior. So I say we, not me. But we do this as humanity. We have institutionalized this, and it's one of the reasons why the economic system is the way that it is. We need to get in on the act. So I mean this very seriously. How good are we, both individually and collectively, at these three things? Because I think there's something magical happens in the center. And I'll just do this very, very quickly. And see if this resonates with people, because I think that in the overlaps between these areas, I think you can start to see some archetypes that, and I don't want to be too provocative about this, but this is, if you identify with some of these things, then I'd ask you again this question, who in your associate network, who do you work with, who are your colleagues, who are balancing your propensity? Because I think there are particular propensities of certainly the people that I work with, where if you take, for example, you really enjoy taking a systemic perspective, and you really enjoy making things to represent that, but you're not really care so much about whether it makes sense to other people. You've probably met people like that. And sometimes it's almost like, I get the sense some people just take pride in how complex the model is that they make, because other people can't understand it. You then got an overlap between the systemic perspective and people who really love understanding how brains work, and how people work, and how do social dynamics work. And this is often dialogue-based facilitators and consultants who work in that sort of space. And in my experience, people like that tend not to be so interested in the symbols. It's all about the dialogue, all about the words. Look up Nora Bateson's response to the Map the System competition, and you get the sense of what's going on in there. And then this final overlap, that's design, right? And the designers, they get how cognition works, not because they've been reading lots of books on it, but because they iterate things over and over again. They use the full repertoire of creativity in order to achieve an effect. And they iterate round and round until they find something that works for the audience. Okay, so I think in the center of that is something magical could happen, but I think we need to find ways of filling all of this and bringing it together. And I am out of time, so I would just say thank you very much. If you're interested in some of those ideas, buy the book. I blog periodically on meaning.guide. I'm not much on Twitter now because I'm just finding it really, really depressing. So I'm not tweeting very much at the minute. If you want to get in touch, there's my details. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. We do have about 10 minutes for a couple of quick questions or comments if anybody would like to. There's been a lot of exchange of ideas, questions, comments in the chat. People keep track, but anybody has any burning question, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Yes, Steve, this is Bernard here.
Hey, Bernard.
I'm just wondering, could you expand a little bit? How would you incorporate the idea of a metaphor into what you've just been saying?
So what I said before about diversity and sharedness, I think very often as soon as you use pictures, then because people use pictures so much in consulting in a metaphorical context, there's an assumption that that's what we're trying to do. It's not. I'm not saying that's the question, but I think there's two different objectives here. That what I'm interested in is how do I get people to see things in the same sort of way. There's another hugely legitimate thing, which is understanding what are the divergences in how people see things, and we do that as well from time to time, but it's not really what we're talking about here. And metaphor is just a fantastic way of doing that. I mean, it's such a fundamental thing about how minds work. And if you're not really sure what the thing is that you're talking about, which is, again, different type of thing, a lot of this talk is predicated on the assumption that we've done the analysis, we are observing patterns, and now we want to invite everybody else in to understand them, to validate them, and to talk about how we could find a solution. But go a few steps back. What if we have absolutely no idea what's going on here? We're just in the middle of this mess. Well, doing some metaphorical modeling with people, we find out about all these different perspectives. And the other thing, of course, is if you're trying to find solutions, doing metaphorical shifts, you can change obviously your entire group's perception, and then suddenly ideas open up, which is one of the wonderful things about being human is that we've got a cognitive apparatus that allows us to do that. But I actually say the same thing. this still all presupposes that there's some common ground, right? When we enter into that space, that for me to understand why your perspective is the way it is, I need to have enough shared language, shared meaning with you in the words that we use to understand why your perspective is different to mine. Yeah, and this is, to be honest, this is how I got into this, was just noticing the number of times you sit in meetings and everyone thinks they're talking about the same thing, and you go and ask them afterwards, you're not talking, and we make the assumption that what words mean to each other is what they mean to us. And I think when you deliberately do metaphorical practices, like clean language modeling is something we use an awful lot. When you explicitly set out to do metaphorical modeling, it gets you out of your own head and forces you to pay attention to, well, what does this, I know what it means to me, but what does it mean to you? But I think it's a different subject.
Steve, can I ask how you see, I mean, shared meaning, yeah. How is it different visually to other media?
So that feels like, it feels to me like the question is assuming that shared meaning is a medium. I'm not sure if that's what you mean.
No, I meant the visual medium as opposed to other.
Using visual medium, I mean, the main difference is that half the processing power of your brain is dedicated to it. I mean, let's take two ends and extremes. So words are fabulous because they're abstracted away from experience, which means that you can do things with them. You can do metaphorical shifts. You can leave things really ambiguous really quickly because you're like, I don't know how many words I'm speaking at the minute per minute, but it's a lot. And if you unpack any one of the words, we go through all of the nouns I've used in this talk and dissect them and just look at all of this cornucopia of meaning that could come out of each one of those words. It's just so efficient. The trouble is that when you're trying to share the meaning, you kind of have to slow down because you've got lots and lots of different people. Well, what do those words mean to different people? If you visualize something, it's a lot less efficient because we now have to stop, and draw a picture of, we use this word, or do we all? But the difference is everyone can look at the picture and say, is that what we all meant by the thing? So you can't use it for everything because sometimes we're talking about something that's so abstract, we could maybe use an icon and then we've got a bit of a handle on it, but we really need to analyze it back down. So you can't use visuals for everything. And I think it depends on what is it that you're trying to achieve? How much time have you got? How ambiguous is the content? How abstract is it? And as I say, this whole talk is assuming that we've done that work, we've generated some insights, and now we want to find a way of maximizing shared meaning. So to me, shared meaning it's a phenomenon. It's when everyone is having that feeling of meaning at the same time, and it's connecting to sufficiently similar mental representations that we can then go on together and have a more meaningful conversation. Did that actually answer your question?
Yeah, in a form, yes.
Okay.
Steve, can I ask a question? Just one of the things I've always found to be a bit of a struggle is how you actually get people who seem to, sort of militate against trying to get some visual understanding to kind of accept forms of visual meaning and visual sharing and perspective sharing, because some would just go, oh, just show me the numbers or show me the description. How do you try and overcome some of that resistance to try to get involved and accept this?
So usually by saying it's not about them, because sometimes it's, particularly that's a sponsor and they don't want you to do what, if you say, well, it's not about you, that's great, you like numbers, most people don't. Yeah, and you can quote statistics on this. Or even if it's a participant in a workshop, if you stress the fact that what we're trying to get to is a shared understanding of how the system works, think about everybody else, and great, put your numbers. The other thing that we're starting to do more and more of, though, is to integrate them all together. So the analogy for this is if you think how Google Maps works, you've got a shared reference model which everyone agrees is true. People don't argue with the fact that the British Isles is this shape, and there's a road there, and there's because you can go and check it, right? And enough people have tried to drive from A to B, and they found that the road does go where that nobody argues about where the road is. But then when you put data on top of it, because think how much of Google's through your traffic reports and heat maps and data about location and so on, it's all data, but it has meaning because it's on a shared context. And this is something we're doing more and more of, is building these sorts of models for organizations and then embedding their data onto the map so that you can meet both people at the same time. Any other questions? Anyone?
There's a question I'm going to pick up, Steve, from the comments, and probably
there's a lot of comments.
the session before we move on. It was by Malcolm. I don't know, Malcolm, whether you want to ask the question yourself, or should I just read it out? About the shared meaning quote.
Right. Okay. What did I ask? It's come back down there now.
Yeah.
Can you still? Oh, right. So, yeah, it was about weird. Just been reading about this recently. Western, educated, industrialized, rational, democratic. So some research that has come out recently, basically saying that Western democracies, to a large extent, are the real outliers. That one's thinking, one whole cognitive way of looking at things, one's whole semiotic framework is determined culturally. So there is a sense for me here, right, is that some of that presentation was perhaps about doing cultural change or changes in the West, but people have been doing on the chat here about the Anthropocene. And for me, I think one of the biggest obstacles we got here is that people literally are fundamentally so different. I actually worry there'll ever be shared meanings. I actually wonder if shared meanings are even possible.
So I think this may be the opportune moment for me to refer to the slide that I said I would refer to at some point.
Oh, right. Okay, good.
Which is when we say shared, we don't mean identical.
Yeah.
Right. We mean statistical correlation.
Yeah.
So is the curve this shaped, or what can we do to push it further together? Because there's things we don't argue about. I often use the illustration of visual perception. That it's very doubtful that anybody on this call, when we all sign off, that we're going to walk into the door, trying to exit the room, because your visual cognition doesn't, it just doesn't let you do that. That's true for everyone, provided you have a normally functioning cognitive system. If there was no shared meaning, then your expression would be very different, because you'd have this interaction wouldn't be possible, right? And it's not about identity, it's about correlation.
I think just as a follow-up from that, though, I think Tony hinted at it before, is, again, it's about the power here. It's like, who's defining the meanings? Who's, basically, this almost feels like the same old story. Let's get some shared meaning, but then the power structures seem to militate against it.
There's a story I tell a lot about. I thought, I probably shouldn't say this, so I'll get into trouble. Maybe you need to edit out the video, but it'll take too long to say it anyway. But it's amazing how well you can see what the actual power structures are, irrelevant of the formal organizational structure, just by noticing how language evolves. Right, the people who have the actual power, their language ends up being adopted by other people. And it's one of these things that it's the joy of being a consultant and going into multiple organizations, and you hear people say things that are a bit weird, and you're like, but it's normal here. Well, where did that language come from? And if you track it back enough, you'll find there was somebody in power at some point who was in a workshop and used this. Like, how are acronyms born? It's because somebody with enough power picked up the marker pen. I mean, I wish it wasn't. I wish it was. Well, I wish we didn't have so many acronyms, but somebody in power picked up an acronym, and then everyone else in the room had to start using the acronym because the person with power said it. And then, poor people, you know, for
Fascinating.
the rest of the year have to use this acronym that no one understands what it means.
And that's not always true, is it, Steve?
No, of course it's not. Of course it's not. But
Yeah. I was going to say, because
It
sometimes
happens.
people just go, "That's cool." They just like it, don't they? Sometimes people just like it for other more ethereal reasons.
Of course.
But I agree.
I think one thing though, which I found fascinating, I think you touched upon at one point advertising, and of course that stems from, is it Louis de Bernays or someone in the 1920s or something?
Edward de Bernays.
Edward de Bernays, yeah. So it's kind of like this idea that it's sort of, again, it's related to power, but it's like this idea of how is meaning created before it can even be shared, and then what's the kind of, like, I'll use Gramsci, but the Gramscian idea of common sense.
I hate to stop this discussion here, Malcolm, but I think actually we're probably slightly out of time. Right, otherwise, we won't give you. But this sounds like a discussion that we could actually continue in a future Dev Day if you fancy doing something around this, or maybe even having a Dev Day on the subject. You know, I mean, we're having a Dev Day on systems laws. Maybe, Leslie, we should have a Dev Day on meaning and metaphor and perspectives and all those tricky little aspects of how humanity connects with others. So I'm just going to say, people, can you show your appreciation for Steve, please, for